the abuser has a plan. If you ever try to escape in any way, they're going to have enough ammunition, right, to hold against you. And that's their plan, so that they don't lose you, so that that shame doesn't actually get exposed. And that certainly was a moment for me when I realized that he had been indoctrinating my children like a cult. I'm actually doing a webinar this week, a cult leader in the home, because it's like a cult. My children were 17 and 19, and they were very indoctrinated against me.
Yeah.
And I couldn't understand what happened. Like I just knew things got really challenging in the home. It was almost sometimes like it was me against everybody else. Like I was like the bad guy. I was a scapegoat. I was. And I still had a high schooler. She was in her senior year living in the house. But I knew if I didn't leave, I would lose her entirely, because at that point she had been so indoctrinated against me. And then there was an incident between she and her father. And so I went and picked her up and I said, when did this start? And you know, these moments in life, right? I'm driving the car. She turned on her playlist. It's the first time I'd heard her playlist ever since she was like 12, and she's 17. And we're listening to the Bee Gees. And I said to her, when did this start? And she said, when I was in third grade. She remembers I had left for a weekend because I had caught him cheating with a good friend of ours. And when I went to work that night, he told them that I had cheated, that I was off my medication, and that I could not be trusted. And she said it started then, where he just consistently, and I always say they start day one. If you're an abuser and you don't have to show your true colors, right? It's like a peacock, right? Like they don't like flutter everything out at once. It's slow. If you're an abuser and you see your partner with your baby, the first time you're holding a baby, there is an igniting of shame right there in that moment, because an abuser recognizes they can never love in the same way. They could never love a child as unconditionally as this person who's perhaps holding the baby, right? But the other thing it does is it also creates an awareness that, oh, I know what matters most to this person. I know. I know exactly what I'll do if anything happens. Now, are they saying that consciously? No. But deep at their core, they know this could be a weapon.
What are some ways that language can be used to control a person?
Verbally diminishing people is certainly a tactic that abusers use. So that's, of course, the verbal assaults that we're all familiar with, name calling, that type of thing, but also just diminishing someone by using your language to do so. It could be something that could be as covert as, oh, I thought we were having this for dinner, not that for dinner, but then it's like a pattern of behavior where the person isn't satisfied by what you cooked for dinner. So I guess going back to the original question, I think about it as a pattern of behavior to diminish another.
Mhm.
And so again, it can be verbal assaults. It can be very overt, which verbal assaults are. It can be very covert. It can also be, I think language is used a lot when we think about different types of language use. So like mockery. Abusers love mockery is their number one form of humor. It's not really humor, is it? It's mocking another person. It's diminishing them. So you could be telling a joke and people think you're telling a joke when actually what you're trying to do is diminish the other person in the relationship, right? Or diminish someone else in the room so that you have power over. That's always the goal. So how is language used? It's used to have power over others.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And if you're in a situation where someone is already in authority, should we be watching for these patterns of verbal attacks that are coming off like, oh, it's just a joke, or oh, I'm just doing my job? Is that kind of the way to distinguish?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of people are in relationship dynamics and they don't realize they're in a subjugated position.
Mm,
So you can say to someone, when you see someone in a position of authority, perhaps just proceed cautiously, ensure your boundaries are in place. Absolutely. But what about the dynamics that occur that you don't even realize someone's in a position of authority over you, right? And I think that that's the tricky part about, as you know, my work is primarily focused on coercive control, narcissistic abuse, and the the interesting part about coercion and control is that it doesn't always show up in your face. It often is a slow, we call it a slow drip, a slow progression over time that erodes a person's autonomy, diminishes them, and then you don't even know. As Dr. Evan Stark, he's the propeller of the term. He was my mentor during my doctoral work. He says it's an unknowing of what you should know. So, to your point, if somebody has an authoritarian position in your life, do you really know they have an authoritarian position?
Hmm. Can
You
be
know?
subtle. And did we get your definition of coercive control?
Sure. No. I see coercive control as an abuse of power. It's an exertion of power and control over another, but also it happens beyond the individual intimate relationships. I see it as something that is much more expansive. I see it as the underpinning of all abuse. If you think about sexism, racism, genderism, sex trafficking, pornography, you name it. All of the oppressions of other people are about one person or group of people exerting power and control over those people or that person. And that's about me as an abuser, let's suggest, me as an abuser, retaining my position of power because that's the only way I feel good. Because the moment I lose my power, I'm exposed and I don't want to be exposed. I have a shield of shame around me. I don't want to be exposed. So there's that. But also, having power, to your point about authoritarian people, people in positions of authority, gives me fame and often gives me fortune.
Mm.
Think about infamous people in the world who have been very harmful to individuals or groups of individuals in society. They have done so oftentimes. There's a secondary reward. It's fortune. Yeah.
For you personally, what was your experience? I know it's a long experience, but of coercive control.
Sure. So I began this work at the age of 19 as a domestic abuse, sexual assault crisis counselor. Yet I didn't know at the time I was dating my abuser. And my abuser would eventually become my husband. And I was with him 27 years and 11 months of marriage, but I knew him 35 or so years of my life. So basically, at the time, by the time the divorce came, a lot of my life. And I was teaching on domestic abuse every single semester. And the term narcissistic abuse had not yet popped up into our vernacular. So, but I knew it was about power and control. But typically, what we've historically looked at abuse as is through the violent incident model. And what we know and what we started the conversation with, right, is that how abuse shows up in a variety of different ways first. And then if I can't control you psychologically anymore, then I'm going to move on to other ways. In the case of my abuser, he went on to exert power and control over the children, unbeknownst to me, and then use the legal system and certainly physical violence can be the result of these relationships, but a lot of abusers are savvy enough to refrain from the physical aspect, right? So, yeah.
And just there are many examples. I've heard you tell your story a few times, but for the coercion, I think you mentioned at one point when you were both very young, he threatened to commit suicide over a breakup, things like this.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, so one of the things that we don't talk often about, and you may know that I am a close friend and colleague of Dr. Ramani, but she and I have this conversation often, this intersection of narcissism, what we know about narcissism and borderline.
Mm.
Like, in other words, abusers do have a significant fear of abandonment, and they do also see the world through a black and white lens. And those tend to be tendencies that we look at through the borderline lens. Now, I should say to you and to your listeners that I really don't adhere to the DSM-5 in general. Um, That's the diagnostic statistical manual that we use to diagnose people. It's where narcissistic personality disorder comes from. It's where borderline personality disorder comes from. I think what we know is most people's behaviors or concerns are as it relates to trauma. And then the question becomes, how do we deal with that trauma? And sometimes people have maladaptive coping mechanisms that get in the way of life. Some people have maladaptive coping mechanisms that harm other people, that make them behave in an abusive way, that make them need to control others. So, yes, I think threats are definitely prevalent in these relationships, even if the threat is, speaking of language, even if the threat is never spoken. It's in the, we call it the meta communication. It's the communication between the communication. You know that if you leave your abuser, you'll probably lose the house, or you know that if you leave the abuser, that they're going to threaten, that they're going to take the children, or you know that if you leave the abuser, that they're going to use a lot of people to say bad things about you, right?
So this way of control, and you talked about how there's this sort of blurring between something that seems a more typical borderline behavior, like the threat of suicide, or there's the more powerful, grandiose, more classically narcissistic way. What would propel someone to need this coercive control over another in the first place?
Mm, that's a great question. So, research affirms that we have many of us are predisposed to a variety of illnesses in life, right? Including physical illnesses, including mental health illnesses, right? Or I wouldn't even call them illnesses, but just challenges in life. And so, like that, we know that some people may be disposed to have a lower level of what we call affective empathy, where they aren't really able to attune to people in the same way, and they can show empathy in a variety of ways, but they can act it, but they don't necessarily always feel it. And and then I think the most prevalent indicator is that then so there's a great Harvard study, and it talks about ego resiliency and ego compromise. So go back to this being born predisposed. I'm simplifying this, really simplifying it, but let's just say that we're all born a little more ego compromised or a little more ego resilient. Think about a fulcrum on a seesaw, right? And so the fulcrum is either a little more over here, ego resilient, or a little more over here, ego compromised. And then you're born, and that's just DNA, epigenetics, intergenerational trauma. It's like it's not that you're bad if you're born ego compromised, but then you're born into a family system where you have no ability to be loved unconditionally. No one loves you in an unconditional way, and you are not allowed to authentically be yourself. You are consistently regulating your behaviors to make the others, the people in your life, the caretakers that you rely on for survival, by the way, you're consistently regulating your behaviors around them. And so, what happens to a developing child is they never actually get to be who they truly are. And as a result of that, they typically do not have a secure, healthy attachment to a parent. And so, what I think the research shows is that attachment is really like fortified by age 3. Bowlby and Ainsworth did some research on this, and so have many other great researchers. But in my work, what I find is that a child could have a really strong, fortified attachment with one parent, and then an abusive parent comes into the system, right? Whether or not the healthy parent decides to escape, get away from that relationship, and the abusive parent works really diligently to erode away the healthy attachment to the healthy parent. And so what I think this goes back to your question, is that people become this way as a result of not being able to be authentic and not having secure attachment. But then they actually begin treating their children the same way when they lose control over a relationship dynamic. And that can set a trajectory for that child to maybe behave in that way. Not all children do, thankfully. Thankfully, attachment can be very fortified and reignited when it's lost. But that is how it's a shame building activity. When you are not able to be yourself, when you are not loved for who you are unconditionally, you learn to devalue yourself. I'm not valuable in this family system. I don't matter. I can't be myself. No one's going to love me as myself. I have to pretend. I have to put on a mask, the narcissist mask, right? And as children develop, does that mask get thicker and thicker and thicker, right? And then one person says, that's it, I've had enough. I'm not dealing with this anymore. And they try to rip off the mask. And at all costs, if I am covering up so much shame, at all costs, I'm going to retaliate because I do not want that mask ripped off. So we talk about like how harmful these people are, right? Especially post separation when we decide to. And I know I'm not just talking about a marital, I'm talking about friendships, I'm talking
Yeah.
about an employer. You
Yeah.
decide to expose an employer. This happens on micro levels and intimate. It happens in meso systems all the time, and it happens in the macro systems. You try to take someone's mask off, and man, there's hell to pay for that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We'll definitely get into that, I think, in some smear campaigns and things like that. First, I would like to get into a little bit of the experience of being in a relationship with this person. It is traumatic. What is a trauma bond?
Uh, so a trauma bond is built on experiences of good and experiences of bad. And so, what abusers are so adept at doing is when we first engage in a relationship with them, everything seems really good, really positive. We're happy. And our body is having oxytocin, the cuddle hormone, and other hormones are having a really great response to that. And then there'll be some bad, but abusers will bring back some good, right? We used to use the analogy of them bringing you flowers after they like physically violated, like after an abuser physically violated someone, the victim would forgive, right? Flowers. But really, it doesn't have to be anything like that. It can just simply be they came home on time. It can be simply that dinner that they brought home takeout like they were supposed to, and that was the plan. And all of a sudden, what happens with victims is they grab onto that good experience and it tethers them to an unhealthy relationship. And so, if it's really very interesting, we began researching this with Biderman's coercion chart in 1957 during the Korean War. And he investigated prisoners of war who were tortured, like literally tortured to elicit false confessions. We're talking about grown men in the military, right? And these grown men would be worn down and eventually acquiesce and even align with their oppressors. And so the human condition can easily be broken with so much at stake. I mean, whether it's stake of your life or it's your family or it's your children, it doesn't matter. The human condition can easily be manipulated with so much at stake. So these prisoners of war would eventually admit to like harboring secrets for the United States. I mean, they would full on like, and that's part of Biderman's work was really interesting is he would show the trajectory. He would start someone at the very top where they're like, no, I never did that. No, you're crazy. I never did that. To eventually being like, well, I don't think I did it. To oh, maybe I did do it, and but I didn't mean to do it, right? To getting to the point where they're like full on, yep, I did it. I'm so sorry. Believing themselves, truly integrating the belief that they had actually done something wrong. And we see this all the time with victims in any kind of an abusive relationship where we get so worn down that we become trauma bonded to the other person. And it's because of that intermittent reinforcement that occurs. And so, these prisoners of war would be given a blanket one night, or they'd be given a piece of bread, and all of a sudden they would want to be friends, quote unquote, with the abusers, with their prison guards, because it felt safest to do that. And so, so back to trauma bonding, I think it's just important for your listeners to know that abusers are again very adept at they start off initially in relationship dynamics giving lots of good, and eventually they can throw you a bone and you're running to it because there is this hope that this person is not who, when you're in this When you're in the associated state, you're seeing that they're a bad person, but now you're going to disassociate from them being a bad person and return back to the bond of the relationship.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you're bringing up these topics too, and you're talking about the different scales that this all works at. I recently spoke with Rick Ross, who's a cult deprogrammer. We talked a lot about the work of Robert Lifton. Who was the gentleman who you mentioned?
Uh, Albert Biderman.
Albert Biderman. I'll have to look him up.
Yeah, they were all around the same time.
Okay.
Robert Lifton, Edgar Schein, and Albert Biderman were all around 1957, and all of their work was about Korean American prisoners of war under totalitarian communist regime in the Korean War.
Yeah. Yeah, it's super interesting, and I think it understanding that spread can give people a sense of how this can work and how dynamic the abuser can be in their methods when you see it played out in different ways. So if it can work in so many ways, and someone like you was an educator in this field, it could still happen too. What is there for prevention?
Mhm. So I think one of the tricky things that we have in our world, and I actually just did a TEDx and I talked about this, that we, first of all, we're never taught the red flags for an abusive relationship. Nobody talks about what red flags are. And red flags is love bombing, future faking. Like ask yourself, okay, this person is in love with me right away. I'm their soulmate right away. Or 3 months in, they want to get married, or, whatever the partnership is, right? Like, is it moving too fast? And then I think, again, knowing red flags, I think I always say, and I say this to my own children, what is the resume of the person that you're dating? What is their emotional intelligence? What is their ability to be self-reflective? And I have a webinar called Where's Your Line? Where is your line? Because at what point do you start to recognize that this may not be healthy? And so understanding the red flags for an abusive relationship, super important. And we need to start teaching people at a very young age, but understanding the green flags. Like, when do you know a relationship is good? Like, when you feel good, when you can be yourself, when you can let go, when you can have a particular belief and someone doesn't make fun of you, when you like a certain song and you're not ridiculed for that music. And, it's mockery. Remember, I always say mockery is a huge red flag. Another huge red flag is using a vulnerability against you and then saying, oh, I didn't realize it meant that much to you. Or saying, oh, I didn't realize I couldn't tell my brother about that. Using a vulnerability against you is huge. Abusers love to do that because what they're doing in the initial stages of the relationship is they're mirroring us. They're mirroring who we are, and they want to be more like us. They truly at their core wish they could, but they know they can't. So they mirror us, and then they take on some of our traits, and all of a sudden we think they're actually a really decent person because frankly, we usually are, right? So yeah. So red flags over and over again. And then, as I said, green flags. Why aren't we talking more about what a relationship should feel like when it's good
Mm.
in our body? And we are just starting to connect, even in the clinical world, we're starting to connect how the body obviously really keeps score, how the body knows what's going on, how we lose, and abusers love to gaslight us. So we lose our intuition. We like we literally, like, as I said, Dr. Evan Stark called it an unknowing of what you know. He has this really amazing quote that I use all the time, and I'll use it here. It's coercive control is like carpenter ants devouring the foundation of a house. You don't even know it's happening until it's too late.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with this too, there's a vulnerability, I think, in believing that people are just generally good. And you said, if somebody takes on your qualities and you think I'm good, they're good, everybody's good. I think you mentioned in an interview that you had 20 years of Catholic school, so you have this whole thing about forgiveness and everything like that. How can we break that and see that some people are evil?
I think the first part of that you just hit the nail on the head is figuring out that that's who we are.
Hmm.
How many people at 18, 20, 25, 30, 40 actually know who they are as human beings? It's like it's an emotional intelligence that takes a great deal of self-reflection. And so, growing up Catholic, growing up in a traditional family, a loving family, I had no red flags in my family system. I had so many green flags, I didn't know what a red flag looked like. So I had the opposite
Yeah.
situation. But I also lived in a subjugated world, as most women and girls do, right? I mean, it's just part of our world order that women are more accommodating. It's a maternal instinct. It's all of those things. It's not to say that men can't be. We know that of course men can be, but it's just more prevalent with women. And so really figuring out, wait a minute, this is a trait of mine. And that's an interesting conversation, right? Like, are you kind and giving in certain circumstances, or are you always overgiving and kind? And even when people have in some way crossed a boundary for you. And so if that's your trait, that's going to be problematic. And I, as you know, have a podcast called Perfect Prey, because I think abusers actually choose. They know who the people are that are going to be accommodating and giving and relationship dynamics. They figured that out. And then those are the people that they're going to be more readily able to push boundaries on, right? So I think knowing ourselves and asking ourselves the question, I'm always talking about the Truility test on the Big Five personality scale. uh, what we know is that victims and survivors rate very high in agreeableness and in conscientiousness. And conscientious means I'm going to fix this thing. Damn it. If it's a bad relationship, if I keep working at it, oh man, I'm going to fix it. Everything's going to be okay. Or I'm going to keep my family together. Or I'm not going to lose this job, whatever the situation is. And abusers rate very low in agreeableness and very high in neuroticism. And so when we talk about how abusers become neurotic about us leaving them, us trying to escape, us quitting the job, whatever it is, it's that neuroticism where they can't give it up. You know, sometimes money, if you give them enough money, sometimes they will give up the fight. But sometimes it's not even money is enough. It's sometimes it has to be, I'm going to decimate you in all ways because you've tried to expose me. So I urge any of your listeners to take that Truility test and find out if they rate high in that area, in the agreeableness and conscientiousness, because if they do, they're more likely to be perfect prey. Victims have a high rate of loyalty, loyal to a fault, a high rate of forgiveness. They will forgive transgressions over and over again to make something work. They see the glass as half full, highly optimistic. Things are going to get better. If I keep working at it, things are going to get better. Oftentimes could be a child of someone who had narcissistic traits, right? An abusive parent who controlled them a lot. And so they over fawn in relationships. They just accommodate over and over again in relationships.
Yeah. An umbrella term that I've heard for folks like this is that they're long suffering, that they'll just sort of keep going with the abuser and keep thinking that it's going to work out and turn it around. And of course, we know how that plays out. So with that, there's a phrase that comes up, a sort of betrayal blindness. What is betrayal blindness?
Sure. It's a phrase that Dr. Jennifer Fried came out with in, I believe, 1996 or 97, because she also came out with betrayal trauma. And really, what she was researching is child sexual abuse victims and sexual abuse victims. And what she figured out is that it's very easy to become blind to the betrayal when the person who's betraying you is someone you rely on. And so um, it's this idea that, why is it that when abusers get caught doing something and then they flip the narrative, right? She also came up with the term DARVO, deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender, is why is it that when they flip and they say you did this, oftentimes victims will become blind to the betrayal. They will actually disassociate from their own abuse in an attempt to keep themselves safer. That feels safer than actually in any way going against this very powerful person. I think you probably know a lot of my work is with children. And when you think about a child who this is their parent who they know is an abuser on some level, or they've experienced the experiences in the home where they felt unsafe, yet this person often has much more power. And so they become blind to their betrayal because it's easier to align with the more powerful person or to acquiesce, just like the prisoners of war, frankly,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So to go from this blindness to trying to see through things, I've heard you describe an exercise called a re-traumatization therapy. Um, what is that?
Yeah. Um, I hate the word, but it's really the only thing because the only way that I personally, after years of attempting to leave and then go back, because the intermittent reinforcement, there would be experiences of really bad, and then there'd be, please come back, you're my soulmate, let's work this out for our family, right? So the only way I could break my own trauma bond to this person was to actually really get to a place where I realized that this person was actually a really horrible person. So I don't believe in black and white thinking. That's actually a really harmful place to be in the world,
Mm,
right? It's hard to have relationships in black and white thinking, relationships with the world, right? But when it comes to abusive people, it's the one time black and white thinking is actually imperative because victims and survivors will look for one good thing to hold on to. And so for me, it became I had to write out every single horrible thing the person had done to me over a period of time. I remember the list had like 56 things on it, and it wasn't everything. And I had to keep looking at that list because I was separated and out of the house that he had locked me out of. So like, isn't that enough? Like you were locked out of, right? Like, isn't, but it's not when there's a trauma bond,
yeah,
right? My
yeah,
neurological response was maybe, oh, maybe there is hope. Maybe things will get better, right? Maybe we'll go to therapy this time, it will work, right? And so we do this thing to ourselves where we retain that hope. And so I had this list, and that list, every time I got a little piece of intermittent reinforcement, I'd look at the list and remind me of the horrific things the person had done. And on a scale of 1 to 10, how horrible were they? Right? Because the other thing is, would you want your sister or your brother or your mother to be engaged in a relationship where someone was treating you this way? So it's about depersonalizing the situation a little bit, personalizing it intensely, feeling that pain, that trauma. My heart just beats sometimes when I think of my re-traumatization list, right? Like, I mean, like it just beats a little faster. But then also saying to yourself, okay, I'm going to give this list to my best friend and she's with this person. Am I
yeah,
telling her to run for the hills? I am, right? Like breaking the trauma bond means actually creating a really great awareness of how I use the word evil, how
mm,
evil that person is. They're willing to do anything to hurt others.
yeah. Yeah. So this is for the individual. One thing that I've heard people say is you can't expose a narcissist; that it'll never work. Have you ever seen anything that works?
That works to make them get better, or do you mean?
This is like exposing them to yourself. Is
Yeah.
you work it through and you go, oh, you did this and you did this. Is there anything that works at scale?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously we don't expose them. Like if we're going to leave them, we don't let them know we're leaving,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, right. We just do our very best to quietly quit, as they say in the work world,
Yeah.
quietly quit the relationship. Is there anything that works? Yeah, not that I'm aware of. I mean, yeah, I think it's too dangerous
Mm,
to take the risk. I think that people who have tried to expose or to let an abuser know how harmful they are, to tell them, let's go to therapy, that it's just another, um, how can I say, it's another game waiting period because all you're doing is prolonging the inevitable. Um, yeah.
yeah. And we've touched at smear campaigns a little bit before too. I think one thing that people don't realize is that the smear campaign is often starting way before you leave. So people are already primed. They already think you are unhinged, you are crazy. Something deliberately vague is very effective, but something so that you're already discredited before you even start. So if you were to say, oh, you know, so and so has been just doing terrible things to me, people are going to say, no, so and so has been telling me for years that you're the crazy one. So it's really hard to move through that. What was your experience with smear campaigning?
Yeah. Yeah. So when I finally escaped the relationship, and I ended up leaving with the items in the trunk of my car. My children were 17 and 19, and they were very indoctrinated against me.
Yeah.
And I couldn't understand what happened. Like I just knew things got really challenging in the home. It was almost sometimes like it was me against everybody else. Like I was like the bad guy. I was the scapegoat. I was the
Yeah.
scapegoat. And it just was heartbreaking. And but I knew that if I didn't, and I still had a high schooler. She was in her senior year living in the house. But I knew if I didn't leave, I would lose her entirely because at that point she had been so indoctrinated against me. And then there was an incident where there was an incident between she and her father, and I had to pick her up. She needed me to pick her up. And so I went and picked her up and I said, "When did this start?" And and you know these moments in life, right? I'm driving the car. I remember the music that was on the radio. We would never listen to music together. She wasn't allowed, like, in other words, she hated all my music. I
Mm.
never enjoyed those periods of time during adolescence where moms and daughters might sit in the car and sing because she would not listen to music with me. It was like, it was a forbidden thing. And it was this day, she turned on her playlist. It's the first time I'd heard her playlist ever since she was like 12 and she's 17. And we're listening to the Bee Gees. And I said to her, "When did this start?" And she said, she said, "When I was in third grade." So the indoctrination occurred when I caught him having what I thought was his first affair and his only affair. Of course, there were numerous. And she remembers I had left for a weekend because I had caught him cheating with a good friend of ours. And between him begging me to come home and go to therapy and we'll work this out, he was also telling me that he was calling the police for kidnapping the children. He knew I was at my parents', but I was so petrified. Um, and I came home after picking them up from school on Monday, and I used to teach on Monday evenings. I came home, dropped the kids off. We said we'd talk. He was going to find a therapist for us. And when I went to work that night, he told them that I had cheated, that I was off my medication, and that I could not be trusted. And she said it started then, where he just consistently, and I always say they start day one. So if you're an abuser and you don't have to show your true colors, right? It's like a peacock, right? Like they don't like flutter everything out at once. It's slow over time, right? And and so if you're an abuser and you see your partner with your baby the first time you're holding a baby, there is an igniting of shame right there in that moment because an abuser recognizes they can never love in the same way. They could never love a child as unconditionally as this person who's perhaps holding the baby, right? But the other thing it does is it also creates an awareness that, oh, I know what matters most to this person. I know. I know exactly what I'll do if anything happens. Now, are they saying that consciously? No. But deep at their core, they know this could be a weapon. And so I believe they start day one. They immediately are threatened by this child. And in some cases, I hear moms say, I'll use moms in this case. I know what happens to dads. I have male clients. I have male clients. I have gay clients. I have the whole, everyone, work with everyone. But that the abuser is jealous of the baby and then is angry about the attention that maybe the protective parent, I'll call, gives the baby. There's certainly that scenario. I had the entirely different one. I went from being his everything, love bombing, wonderful. There were definitely signs of abuse before we had children, but I went from being his everything to being like demoted in the family
Mhm.
system. The child became his everything. And so there's that scenario too. So I do believe they start day one, and that the smear campaign for me, little did I know, was going on for 8 years on developing brains. They were hearing horrible stuff about me for 8 years. I remember one time I was really, really angry. And because abusers like us to, right? We call it provoke and record,
Right.
or right.
Yeah, they call it
And
reactive abuse, I think I've heard.
well, so actually, I if I have my druthers, that would probably be on my top 10 list that we would get rid of
Okay.
reactive abuse
Yeah.
because it's self-defense.
Yeah.
When you are cornered over and over again and harmed over and over again. Are you an abuser, a reactively abusive, or are you actually behaving in the body's regulation state is self-defense? You're
Mhm.
going to defend yourself finally. I call it like a percolating coffee pot. Like eventually it's going to blow,
Yeah.
and it might blow at like the most like subtle thing, but it was a buildup of time over and over again of being called a name or being made fun of for your music, or oh, look at her dance, doesn't she dance weird, like all of those things. And then that one day it's something simple like, did you take the coffee, and you explode. Self-defense.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like
S-
provoke and record too. I've dealt with one of these people, and he loved to record everything, and he sort of appointed himself as collective videographer. And at the same time, he was developing situations that were more and more pressure, more and more boundaries being crossed, while also for some reason they just happened to be moments that needed to be filmed. He was setting people up. So I like this provoke and record, and I'm going to hold on to that. What
yeah,
were you going to say?
Lisa Fontes came up with that term. She's a coercive control
Okay.
expert, and she wrote the book Invisible Chains. Yeah. And so, yeah. And so, but I do tell victims that if you can record situations without the abuser knowing, then you can go back and listen and prove to yourself you're not crazy.
Mhm.
Sometimes recording incidences helps us, again, re-traumatizes us. It's re-traumatization theory, right? Like it's re-traumatizing us, but it actually helps to solidify for us that, oh my gosh, that I didn't do that. They told me I did that. I didn't even do that. Right. So yeah, I'm not sure where I was going with the conversation before that.
Sorry, I think I might have pulled us off a little bit. We're talking about smearing and how it starts very early, and you're saying on
Yeah.
developing brains of your children, and then they can do this sort of provoke and record method.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think the end result is recognizing that the abuser has a plan. If you ever try to escape in any way, they're going to have enough ammunition, right, to hold against you. And that's their plan, so that they don't lose you, so that that shame doesn't actually get exposed. And that certainly was a moment for me when I realized that he had been indoctrinating my children like a cult. I'm actually doing a webinar this week, a cult leader in the home, because it's like a cult. And the children are significantly harmed because, going back to that betrayal blindness and betrayal trauma, not only did they know at their core that what he would do if they ever violated him, he'd reject them, he'd maybe, like, behave in harmful ways. So there's a trauma there because I'm betrayed by this person that is a caretaker. But then he made them think that I was betraying them. He made them think I was unhinged, that I was unstable, that I was this horrible person. So, what happens to children when they're in this situation with two people, one person healthy, one person unhealthy, but they're made to believe the healthy person's unhealthy? They're literally out to sea. Like
Mm.
they've got no anchor. And that's not healthy on the developing brain. It leaves them feeling really adrift, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. What you're helping me to see too is the incredible vulnerability of the love bombing phase. I had thought at first that it was just something to sort of get you hooked. And then I'd heard Mark Vicente, who's a cult whistleblower, talk about how it's also something to data mine on you. So I thought, okay, maybe they get, some dirt on you or something. They know your biggest fear. And now I'm hearing you talk about this story with your children and how they're also recognizing the things that matter most to you, the
Mhm,
targets to hit,
mhm.
as well as the things to turn against you. This period when you think that you've got somebody who really cares for you, and in fact, they're just scoping you out very carefully is an extremely vulnerable and dangerous time. I hope more people can learn to spot it. Are there signs of the love bombing phase when it's not just a sincere excitement to start a new relationship?
Yeah, I guess that I would say just listen. The problem is that when we're in love, we
Mm,
often forget to listen to our body,
mm,
and our body might be giving us other signals. And I would say, first of all, take it slow. Like, we don't have to rush into moving in with somebody in 3 months. I mean, the reality is we don't really know people for at least a good year. It's kind of the rule of thumb. Like, do you
yeah.
really even know someone after a year? I don't know, but certainly you don't really know someone until a year. And how, you know, the other thing that, again, like when I went back, I said the resume, like, who are these people's relationships with, and are they actually authentic? This is the key. The word is authenticity. Victims very often have a variety of authentic relationships with people that the abuser tries to take away and
Hmm.
isolate them from. But abusers don't really have deep, authentic relationships. And that's not hard to spot. It's like you can watch them in relationship dynamics and see how vulnerable they are with others, and ask the question, are they still friends? You don't have to be friends with your elementary school people, but do they have a friend from high school that they're still very connected to, that they have really strong relationship dynamics because of memories that were created? These are, like, again, the, looking for the red flags. If someone doesn't have authentic relationships with others, if they keep having fracturing, if things are black and white. I often say that about, like, in politics, it drives me a little bonkers that people have black and white thinking about politics in general. Regardless of how devastated or great you feel about our current climate, the reality is that if we can't sit down and have a dialogue about why maybe you feel one way and I feel another way, that black and white thinking is harmful. It doesn't bring people together. It creates division. And so if you're with someone who has black and white thinking about anything, ask yourself why.
Hmm.
Are they threatened by it? Are they threatened by another person's opinion? Are they threatened by the fact that your brother just moved to a really nice town and now your abuser thinks that town sucks, Like, and these are really, they're
Yeah.
important. Yeah, they are definitely important conversations to be. So we have to be data mining. To Mark's point, oh, I adore Mark and he's a good friend. To Mark's point, we have to be data mining.
Hmm.
And so my clients are always, they're like, you're telling me to be a little manipulative, or I said, no, we're strategizing. Abusers play checkers with us, and they're playing chess and they play checkers with us. We have to play chess. And if we don't level up our game and actually really look at relationships and how impactful they are, I mean, if I could tell you about the amount of mothers who had children, found a great partner and partnered up with somebody, and then it ended up being abusive, or fathers that this has happened to, and how harmful that is to children, you know, we have to be much more cautious.
Yeah, yeah. There's a weight in our relationships, and I think that's interesting that you're pointing to this while also pointing to the fact that if somebody doesn't see that, if somebody has rather than deep, meaningful relationships, instead they have a broad but shallow network. They seem to kind of know everybody, but they're not really connected in a meaningful way. That's going to be a major sign to look for. So that discrepancy in how you value relationships.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Right. And it's just a little bit of, is that if relationships matter to you and you're with someone who has a pattern of making you compromise those relationships, even if it's out of worry, love,
Mm,
concern.
yeah.
If they have a pattern of trying to compromise those relationships, you have to take a step back and ask yourself why they're threatened by him.
Yeah. This sort of experience seems to shake a person's identity as well. If you're around this, like we said in the beginning, if you're taking the criticism and everything, you're trying to deal with all this stuff. Maybe the people around you eventually get isolated from. What can we do to protect our identities?
Oh, well, I think recognizing that we're in a toxic relationship and getting out of it more quickly, right?
Hmm.
I say that knowing that things get worse oftentimes
Yeah,
after escape,
yeah.
right? So I think it's really important that people retain their, um, like, whether it's a career, whether it's their, hobbies. Like, in other words, there are people who are in abusive relationships, and how do they retain their own autonomy and agency in their life? They retain those things that matter to them.
Mm,
Abusers will try to wear that off, like, take that away. And our goal has to be to hold on to that. So I would say to, like, any of your listeners who are living in this situation, give yourself an opportunity to create something, whether it's tennis or it's, something for yourself, regular exercise, to retain that autonomy. Because when you're ready to leave, the word is escape. When you're ready to escape,
Mm.
the you're going to need to have something to anchor yourself with, and not having anything makes it much more challenging.
Mm. One thing a little more technical that I just wanted to get your expertise on. What is the Karpman triangle?
The what triangle?
The Karpman triangle, the sort of persecutor, rescuer, victim triangle of conversation.
It's interesting that you bring that up because, um, I look at it through a lens of going back to the truility, like the idea that, um, yeah, you're making me think of fawning now too.
Mm.
So, right? I mean, really, it's like it's an inability to really clearly see that you are a victim and that you actually. I think what we're talking about here is it can kind of segue into victim blaming, right?
Mm.
This idea that the victim actually gets engaged in this process of being pursued in this way, and then they continue to go back to it. And it reminds me of the cycle of violence. So the cycle of violence we are now saying is really not a valid source, because if we think about the triangle, it's not necessarily circular. It's a little bit of back and forth.
Hmm.
It's not just one thing after another that occurs. It's a little bit back and forth. And I think that what we realize now when we think about the domestic violence cycle, and these other ideas of, for me, it feels a little victim blaming. It feels like a little bit like we're saying that a victim had an ability to get out, but that they retained the cycle because they were familiar with it. And that familiarity is not necessarily, I don't see that as a victim's fault. I see that as a perpetrator exerting the control over them. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So when we come up with ideas about why a victim stays versus why a perpetrator abuses, I tend to get a little bit, yeah, defensive maybe, because I don't. This is an important question when we think about abusive relationships, and you know, would anybody choose to be in an abusive relationship? Right.
Sure.
And also, like, it's this idea of, we ask victims all the time, why did you stay? And the reality is why did the perpetrator abuse? So some of these theories I just have a hard time with.
Sure. Yeah. Well, for people who appreciate your unique perspective, before I ask my last question, where should people look for you online?
I'm at Course of Control Consulting, is my website, and Dr. Cocchiola on Instagram and most every place else.
All right. We'll put links to
Yeah.
that in the description for everybody to check out. And Dr. Christine Cocchiola, my final question is, what has it been like for you to now be on the other side and to be helping other people with these situations?
Sure. So I think what's interesting again is I've been doing it since I was 19. I just didn't know I was experiencing it.
Hmm.
And for your listeners, I want them to hear that, because you can be so embedded in the trauma bonding that it feels like kind of unbelievable to me that I didn't see it and didn't know it. Um, but what I'm trying to do is, Maya Angelou has an amazing quote. It's, there's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. And for me, I want victims to know that coercive control, narcissistic abuse can happen to anyone. And by giving it voice, I hope to prevent others from suffering in silence. I mean, that's my hope. So I, I'm perfectly open about it, because a lot of we've been told that we should be ashamed, we should be uncomfortable, like, how could it happen to you, or why didn't you stop it? And it's like, nope, that's not actually how it goes. It isn't being pursued and persecuted and all of that. It is more about a person who actually chose to really diminish my autonomy. And frankly, as an aside, I had a very successful career.
Mm.
I was, it's, this is not like I wasn't a stay at home mom. I had a very, I mean, I was with my kids a lot, but I had a very successful career. And I was not being diminished outside of my home. I was only being diminished in the home. And that's what abusers do, right?
Well, Dr. Christine Cocchiola, thank you so much for sharing your story, for helping people, and for taking this interview with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Brad.
To help raise awareness about narcissistic abuse, please share this video. It helps a lot.